Hey everybody, welcome back. Alright, so today we're going to be subtracting rational numbers. Let's back up to the beginning. Okay, when you think about subtracting rational numbers, I hope you think about what we learned in chapter number 1, where if we had a problem 6 minus 4, what that means is that I want to go negative 4, negative 6, and then I want to go another negative 4, and I end up here at negative 10. What that meant was that if we mapped out this problem, we got to negative 10, and we found out that it was the exact same thing as if I did negative 6 plus negative 4. And so we learned we could turn every subtraction problem into an addition problem simply by adding the opposite. So we added, and the opposite of 4 was negative 4. And we're going to use this exact same thing to be able to deal with fractions and decimals. So notice, to be able to solve this, instead of subtracting 11, I add the opposite of instead of subtracting 1/2, I'm going to be adding the opposite of 1/2, would be negative 1/2. When I do that, I go negative 1/2 plus another negative half, and notice, I end up right here at 2. Alright, let's see how this works. When dealing with decimals, adding and subtracting, remember the rule is to line up the decimals. Okay, so I have a subtraction problem. I could simply subtract it, or I could add the opposite of 3 and 33/100ths to negative 3 and 33/100ths. When we look at these in our class, we talk about the fact that these are different. These are positive and these are negative. So they're different. How do we handle different problems? We subtract them. So when I subtract them, I make sure the decimals are lined up, and I do my subtraction. The only thing we want to make sure of is the answer going to be positive or negative, and since there were more positives, that means the answer is positive 22 and 37/100ths. In this problem, 14.04 minus 9, notice we add, and then the opposite of positive 9 is negative 9. They're different, we subtract them. Make sure the decimals are lined up, and we get our answers. Since the larger number was positive, the answer is positive. Make sense? All right, well, in this one, notice, I am subtracting a negative number. So how do I fix that? Well, I add, and the opposite of negative 3 and 24/100ths is positive 3 and 24/100ths. Do you now notice these are different? And since they're different, we subtract. When I subtract now, decimals are lined up. I get 0, I get 4, and I get 0. Notice the decimal comes straight down. The question is, which number was bigger? And you'll notice 3.64, or 3 and 64/100ths, is bigger than 3 and 24/100ths. So that would mean that the answer is negative. Any questions? I hope you notice that I have minus positive 12 and 87/100ths, so I add the opposite of positive 12 and 87/100ths is negative 12 and 87/100ths. Do you notice that they're both negatives now? And when they're both negatives, they're the same. So we're going to add these negatives together. Hey, in case you haven't noticed, I apologize. There should be a 2 here because we all know 1 plus 1 is 2. All right, I will fix that. But this is the correct answer. Any questions? Oh, there's the 2. My apologies, I will fix that also. All right, so now we're on to fractions. I hope you realize that the same rules that applied for the positive and negative integers that applied for the positive and negative decimals will be the exact same rules that apply to the positive and negative fractions. So if I have negative 1/7 minus 4/7, I change this to plus negative 4/7, and then when I add those together, I get negative 5/7. Notice, I had negative 1/7 and negative 4 more sevenths. I add them together, hopefully you notice there were 5 sevenths. 5 negative sevenths. In this situation, I hope you notice, what am I going to do? I'm going to add, and the opposite of positive 4 is negative 4. So I'm going to get 8 plus negative 4. and I get the answer 4. If I had 8 and I took away 4, notice how many I'd have left. All right, once again, -1/9 plus minus 4/9. I'm going to add, and the opposite is going to be -4. So now these are the same. Negative and negative are the same, so I'm going to add them together to get -5, and I get -5/9. Over here, I'm going to add, and the opposite of -3 is +3. And then negative and positive, they're different, so I'm going to subtract these numbers, and the answer will be negative because there are more negative numbers. Any questions? In order to do these problems, you don't have to be any smarter, but you do have to pay a little bit more attention. And the biggest problem will be that students will just accidentally forget one of these little steps, or they'll lose focus for a moment, and then they'll have some issues. So please try to remind your students to always make sure to focus and pay attention. In this situation, I hope you notice, I don't have common denominators in this one. So I'm going to need to get common denominators, but I can always add and then get the opposite of +1 and get to -1. When I get my common denominator, do you notice that 3 times 4 was 12, so 3 times 3 was 9, and 2 times 6 was 12, and 2 times -1 was -2. Since they are different, 9 and -2, I subtract these numbers, and there are more positives. That's why the answer is +7/12. Over here, I'm going to need to get a common denominator. Common denominator is going to be 35. When I add the opposite will be -2. I end up getting -2 times 5 gets me -10. -1 times 7 gets me -7. And since they are both negative, -7 plus -10, they're the same thing, so I add them together. I have 17 negatives, so my answer is -17/35. All right, lastly, what if we have variables? Well, we'll tell you what the variable is, and you can substitute it in. Then you can add, and the opposite of -6.5 would be +6.5. They're the same, they're both positive, so I add them together. Decimal comes straight down, and I get my answer. Could I do this with fractions? You betcha. Notice, I substitute in. The opposite of +2/8 is -2/8. -3 plus -2, they're the same. I'm going to add them together. -3 plus -2 is -5. And that's our lesson. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to let me know, and I will see you guys in class.